The teachings of General Conference are the considerations the Lord would have before us now and in the months ahead.
Our marching orders for each 6 months are found in the General Conference addresses.
For the next 6 months, your conference edition of the Ensign should stand next to your standard works and be referred to frequently.
I encourage you to read the talks once again and to ponder the messages contained therein.
I exhort you to study the messages of this conference frequently, even repeatedly, during the next 6 months.
You're listening to the Conference Talk Podcast, where it's conference weekend every weekend. Each weekend on this show, we discuss talks from the most recent General Conference of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We'll share some insights, make some connections, and hopefully have a bit of fun as we study the words that the men and women that God has called to direct His church in these latter days. I'm Matthew Watkins, and I'm joined by a very special guest today that I'm sure we're going to have a lot of fun with, Shawn Rapier from the Latter-day Lives podcast. Shawn, say hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me on, Matthew. I appreciate it. I'm super excited. I got excited when you just mentioned conference weekend every week. Like every week, it's conference. Let's do this. I got really excited because I love conference.
Break out the cinnamon rolls.
Bust out the cinnamon rolls and let's do that. I didn't make cinnamon rolls. That's what we should have done. For Pete's sake, I should have busted out all the traditions. That would have been great.
Well, so what are your conference traditions?
You know, it's funny. So for a while, I was doing a podcast called Sharing Time, and I was hosting that with Ken Craig. Some of you who have seen Once I Was a Beehive and Once I Got Married, Ken was the bishop in that, and he's a dear friend of mine. We did improv stuff together for years in the Garen's comedy troupe at BYU. And Ken has this tradition where they actually dress up on Sunday. Their whole family puts on Sunday clothes and watches it from their living room. We are the antithesis of that. We are, the most comfortable pajamas I can find are what I am wearing for it. It's one of the joys for me of conference. And, we don't have a lot of family traditions. When the kids were younger, my youngest is 18 now, but when the kids were younger, we'd get out Legos and they'd build Legos while they were watching, and we'd try to talk about it and whatnot. Our big tradition was around priesthood session. You know, that was our big thing. Was I'd have my boys, and once they started showing it on TV where we weren't going to the chapel, we'd invite neighbors over. I'd barbecue. I'd make a whole bunch of ribs, and we'd all watch and eat ribs. And
Priesthood session block party, huh?
Yeah. So I still usually will barbecue that day, and then we'll have kids over and we'll watch. And I just love conference weekend. I'm always just a little sad when it's over, but filled up and so good.
Partly because of the barbecue, partly because of the spiritual message.
I am filled in every regard. Yes, spiritually, physically, mentally, I'm all in.
Well, on your comfortable clothing remark, I will say we had a 70 come do state conference last week, and he will not be named, but he told us from the pulpit, he said, "Now, how do you think general authorities watch conference at home?" He says, "I was in my pajamas."
Yeah, that would be a true test. If you ever wanted to be released, I would say show up in your pajamas, and that might get you out of future speaking assignments. But it's great, and that's what I love is that Ken's family loves to have this tradition of dressing up, and some people do a specific breakfast or a specific dinner, or they'll play a game in between or whatever it is. I love that people have their traditions. And then my other tradition, I would say, this is just me personally. I'd like to walk most mornings. I just go walk around for a couple miles, and I listen to a conference talk almost every morning. And that's one of my things. I'll listen to the Book of Mormon. I'll listen to a conference talk, and I just love it. So by the end of my 6 months, I kind of got it nailed down. I'm ready for the new stuff. Let's do it.
That is awesome. It reminds me of Elder Holland shared a talk where a bunch of friends went out and they decided to climb, I guess it was Y Mountain or somewhere out in Utah. I'm not a Utahn, so I don't know which mountain it was. But they were climbing and they brought the transistor radio. They got up to the top, brought out the lunch, said, "Now we're going to sit down for 2 hours and listen to conference." And what a experience that was.
Awesome. Love it. Yeah, we just love it. Love conference.
And you loved this talk. Now, I gave you several options of talks you could choose from, and you chose Sister Aburto's talk. And
Yes.
tell me why you chose that.
So I loved this talk so much, and it's funny because you had given me all of the options, although they started falling fast as you were. Maybe I'm showing too much behind the curtain, but as you were talking to other people, but it didn't matter. I had this one dialed in from the beginning. I love Sister Aburto so much, and a lot of why I chose this talk. I'm on the High Council right now, and we often get to choose our topic. And I've been speaking on similar topics to this. In fact, I'll be speaking in May to a ward on a similar topic. And one of the things I love is Sister Aburto herself. And you look at, by the way, I served a mission in Chile 30 years ago, so that was a very Spanglishy version of Aburto. I should just go with straight English, Reina Aburto, because my Reina Aburto is not good. But
Está bien.
one of the things I love is just at the beginning. And one of the things that touched me during conference, I'm not one of those guys who likes to go on social media and follow like what's happening with social media. It's too distracting for me. I have severe ADD. I can't watch, process, feel the spirit, and worry about what other people are saying on Twitter. And so I got on Twitter after, I think it was after the Saturday session. But I got on Twitter and there were some beautiful comments, and I was interested to see what stood out to people. But of course, there's some negatives. And one of the negatives was somebody had said, I didn't watch conference because I don't need an old white man telling me what to do. And I thought, you didn't watch conference, because I proudly present Sister Aburto. She is not old, not white, not a man. And she opens her talk. I mean, literally, you look at the first sentence, that she had received the invitation. I attended the church for the first time at age 26. Okay, so now we know we have someone who was not born into the church. So now she is connecting with people, because a lot of our general authorities, and I think there's great power in it, a lot of the authorities who speak have that birth tradition. Their grandfather was an apostle or whatever it was. But she was not. She did not join the church till she was 26. Then she says, second sentence, I had recently separated from my first husband. Wait a minute, she's divorced. So now she's a convert. She's divorced. By the way, her last name is Aburto. She has an accent. She's not from Salt Lake City. All these things piling up just fill my heart with joy as we have this beautiful global church. Then the next sentence is, I had a 3-year-old boy. She's a single mother. Wow, she is going to connect with so many people. And it says, I felt powerless with fear. Who hasn't felt powerless with fear? Although sometimes I think we think, oh, authorities have it all figured out. They haven't gone through these times like I have. And then she says, when I entered the building, I was filled with warmth. As I perceived the faith and joy of the people surrounding me, it truly was a refuge from the storm. She could have ended her talk there, and it still would have been my favorite talk from this last conference. These are the voices, pure testimony, coming from a place where I just wanted to go back to that person on Twitter and just forward that talk and say, excuse me, I'm sorry, what were you saying about old white men from Utah, whatever your stereotype is? I present Sister Aburto. And it was such a great framework. Then where she went with it, this talk is Christ. This talk, if you look at Christ and his ministry, just the ministry part of what he did, not the atonement, not the birth, not the significance, but his ministry, where did he go? He went to the poor. He went to the sick. He went to the needy. He went to those who really needed him. Where does Sister Aburto go with this talk? She goes to the poor. She goes to the needy. She goes to the people who feel that they're not enough. She goes to those who need repentance, who need the atonement. And to me, it is such a beautiful example of Christ. And I think sometimes we get caught up. This is what I was getting back to. Some of what we're speaking on is, we either get caught up in ourselves that there should be a prototype for a member of the church, or there should be a molded image of this is how members of our church are. And that can really be off-putting for somebody who doesn't fit that mold. But I think there must have been so many people, I get emotional just talking about this. How many people heard this talk and went, oh my gosh, they might welcome me in that church. That church sounds like somewhere that I can go. And that's why you asked a simple question. I just gave a really long answer, but that's why I chose this talk. It was just it was the messenger. She set that table, and then the message was phenomenal.
She really did. She broke the mold entirely. And that's something that really jumped out at me. I don't know that I've ever heard a talk where a general officer of the church started or even acknowledged that they'd had a failed marriage.
Yeah.
We focus so much on the ideal, and we can't shy away from the ideal, of course, but sometimes it feels like we don't make space for the realities that are different and the circumstances that are different. And yeah, that just really blew me away. Something else from that first paragraph where she talked about 3 weeks later, she could have just said 3 weeks later, I was baptized.
Yeah.
We get it. But she wanted to focus it on the Savior and help us realize the sanctity of that decision.
Yeah.
She said, 3 weeks later, I made the baptismal covenant with Heavenly Father and started my journey as a disciple of Christ. It's like, wow, when you think about it that way, it really puts some gravity and weight to it. It's just amazing.
And I love that she brought up the covenant. And that was a big theme in this last conference was covenants. Covenants came up again and again. I noticed that. But one of the other things I love about her starting off with, as a recently divorced woman, I think that, to your point, not only is it the ideal, but it can be perceived as, okay, we'll still accept you even though you had this big problem. Mm-hmm. And try to hide it. It's not the ideal and, whatever. She's putting it right out there. Hey, this is something I went through. And this is something a lot of members of the church go through. I mean, it's very common and they need to hear voices. I'm just touched that the church is so focused on, we need to hear voices that sound like our own. And there are a lot of people whose voices sound like Sister Roberto's. In reality, like literally sound like hers with her accent, as we tend to grow in Latin America, but also her story. It's a very real story. We have it in every ward in a lot of families. And yeah, what an amazing woman.
And how wonderful that her branch rallied around her, right? Never does she even intimate that the ward's like, oh, look, another welfare case.
Yeah. Yeah. Not at all. And it wasn't, she just says everyone was there for her, and which is an example of how we should be. We should all be like that ward. Just awesome.
And I loved her wording about what they did. She said it was a branch filled by covenant members. There's covenant again, ready to embrace me and my son as we were brought to the Savior. And then later in the talk, she points out, she says, our purpose in his kingdom should be to bring each other to Christ. And I got to think, I said, if you were to just go and ask members of the church, what's your responsibility towards each other, especially to recent converts? They might list like the threefold mission of the church. I guess it's fourfold now.
Yeah.
President Hinckley's talk, which she referenced about, every member deserves a calling and a responsibility and nourished by the good word of God and a friend in the church. But how many people would just sum it up and say, our duty is to bring others to Christ?
Yeah. I thought that was beautiful. I also really like a little bit further down, She gives the quote, "The church is the scaffolding with which we build eternal families." And that was a really deep comment that she had made. And one of the things I love is now she's talking about eternal families. She didn't say, oh, and then I got married again. And then the church became the scaffolding because I was married. Now I was the ideal again. She just says, this is what the church is. And I think that for a lot of people, when we talk about eternal families, there are some people for which that is not a happy topic. Mm-hmm. That's a tricky one. I was reminded probably 5 or 6 years ago, I was asked to give the closing prayer on Mother's Day at church. And the person who had given the opening prayer in sacrament meeting gave a beautiful opening prayer, all about how grateful we were that we could celebrate mothers and how wonderful our mothers are. And then we had talks about mothers that were beautiful. It was a fantastic, service. And then I got up to give the closing prayer, and I had not planned on this at all. But as I was giving the prayer, I felt this strong impression. And I said, please bless those for whom Mother's Day might be a difficult or tricky day. Those who may have lost a mother or maybe don't have the relationship they want with their mother. And I finished that prayer. I had no less than 6 people who came up to me afterward, one woman in tears, who said, I sat there that whole meeting and it was so painful. I have no idea what her situation was with her mother. But she said, it was such a relief that there was something about mothers for me at church today, that you prayed for me. And the fact that here we have Sister Roberto, after opening up with, I'm a divorced single mother, testifying that the church is the scaffolding with which we build eternal families, I just think is so beautiful. And it gives everyone hope that whatever your family situation is, it's going to be worked out. It's going to be worked out in the end. Just love it.
Yep. And sometimes scaffolding, you're not going to finish the whole building before your project runs out of time.
Yeah.
The scaffolding stays up even when there's construction to be done later. Yeah.
And that's all that matters. So love it. I also wanted to, if we could go to the next part of it, actually, was another one of my favorites where she's talking now. Here she is. She's joined the church and now she's serving others. And obviously, I mean, in her calling, she gives a lot of service, but she's talking to a friend who was going through a financially difficult time. And he was receiving, fast offering funds. He was receiving help from the church. She says something that's really, really profound here, where she talks about how the people are the church, that we are the church. And that's, I think for some people, it's hard to receive help. It can be difficult, but this is why the church is. And when I love a little further down, she talks about how sometimes we're here to receive and sometimes we're here to give, and there are seasons. And, I've been very blessed. I've never questioned tithing, not once. And in our marriage, every time either my wife or I get paid, I have made it a point to pay tithing before anything else. Like in fact, I love that I can do it online now. It's a lot easier. And I just love tithing and giving. But we were one year, in fact, in 2001, I had been laid off right before 9/11, literally 10 days before 9/11. My company went out of business and I was out of a job. And I work in technology, and I couldn't get an interview. And finally, one of my old sales guys I used to work with, he and I started a company together, and we agreed we were going to live on savings for a year and not take anything out of the company, just put it all back in. And so suddenly tithing settlement came around. And, I've been very blessed in my life. I'm almost 50 years old, and financially we've been blessed. We're not wealthy, but we've really never had a financial issue. But that particular year we were living on savings. And I remember my wife and I went in and sat down with our bishop, and, we had probably 5 kids at the time, and we sat down and I handed him my tithing, summary. And I think we had paid $300 for the year.
Wow.
And, of course, I was a very active member of our ward, and our bishop looked at it and he looked at me like he didn't know what to say. He had no idea what we were going through. And you could tell it was painful for him. He said,
were your kids in the room at the time?
Our kids were in the room.
Oh, wow.
And he said, Brother and Sister Rapier, are you full tithe payers? And I smiled and said, yes, we are. That is a full tithe for the year. And he said, okay. And he signed. And then he looked at us and he said, okay, what are we doing for the kids for Christmas this year? And it was such an emotional time. I had never been through that before. And I explained to him, no, we planned on this and the company is starting to take off. We've just been and we're fine. We don't need that help. But what a blessing that it was there. And I'm so grateful for that year that I was able to pay so little, and be a full tithe payer. Like, how awesome is this church? And, fortunately, we've been blessed in subsequent years that we've paid a lot more, and paying a lot is a blessing. But I don't know that I will ever have a tithing settlement as spiritually beautiful as that one. And I was very touched when she was talking, and she says, the church is the members. They're the ones who willingly and joyfully give fast offerings to help those in need. You're receiving the fruits of their faith and determination to follow Jesus Christ. I love that because I was offered it that one time. Gratefully, we didn't need it at the time, and I've been able to pay it other times. And what a blessing.
It is a blessing, and what a blessing for us to be able to participate on really on both ends of that, but especially to serve. And I really like the way that fast offerings works different from other charities. You know it's being used locally. You know it's being used within the ward with people that you know and don't even know that they need it.
Yeah.
And that's a really beautiful aspect of it. I'm reminded of a quote from Elder Renland, where he said, the greater the distance between the giver and the receiver, the more the receiver develops a sense of entitlement.
Wow,
and
that's powerful.
When you know
I think I'd heard that before.
It's a few years ago. The reason it hit home was my parents had took in a homeless member of the ward that wasn't fully mentally accountable, I guess I should say. She had about the maturity of about a 12-year-old, and they kind of took on a parental role, coaching her and helping her.
Beautiful.
And she was receiving fast offering funds and using them for purposes that, let's say, they're not intended for. And they had a conversation with her, and they said, "Well, how would you feel if sister so and so, or sister so and so, your friends in the ward, understood that this money was being used for that?" And she said, "Oh, I would never do something like that with money that came from Sister Hope or Sister Berlin." And they had this conversation with her and said, "Well, the fast offerings we receive, they're not from some faceless organization called the church." And they talked exactly what Sister Aburto talked about. We are the church.
Yeah.
Sister Berlin, Sister Hope, all of your friends in church, we're the ones that are all contributing to the fast offerings. And so it really is a sacred trust that we are given. And what a blessing it is to give that sacred trust and then also to receive and to help understand that more.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. I had an experience when my wife and I were young married couple. We had bought our first house, and the bishop called me in. I don't know what on earth inspired him to call me to this, but he called me in and he said, "Shawn, I am really too much of a softie. I can't say no to anyone." And he said, "I just found out from Salt Lake that we have the most out of whack ratio of donations to what we give out of pretty much any ward in the state." He said, he said, essentially we're kind of in trouble, or at least they're asking what's going on. And he said, "I'm extending you a unique calling. I'd like you to go meet with everyone who is receiving assistance and sit down with them, find out their situation." He said, "We've had some people who have been on assistance for 7, 8, 10 years. And he said, I don't have the heart to ask what's happening. I don't, I just can't get involved, but I'd like you to, and I will listen to you and you decide." And he said, "Don't be afraid to ask them to open their checkbooks, go over budgets, ask where the money's going." And he said, I was really, he felt that need to respect the funds. And I was probably 24 at the time. Can you imagine a 24-year-old walking in, sitting down, saying, "Hey, show me your finances,"
So your bishop kind of outsourced all of his difficult conversations to you.
Yes. And I was young, dumb, and arrogant enough to go, "Okay, I'll do it." So I go cruising in, and the first family that I met with, they had justification for everything. They're ordering in pizza 3 times a week. All church funds, and it's, look, should families celebrate and enjoy pizza from time to time? Of course. If you are struggling financially and you're ordering pizza literally 3, 4 times a week, and then, at the time there was no streaming internet. And so they had this $200 a month cable package because that was the babysitter for the kids. It was cheaper than getting a babysitter, and everything was this reason. And I had to have a very difficult conversation with them. It was so uncomfortable for me. And I was not their favorite person when I walked out of there. And that happened a few times over. That happened a few times where I had to sit down and say, "Look, we need to work on the process of moving you onto self-reliance." Self-reliance is a as a gospel principle. And there were some people in the ward that didn't like me because they had gotten used to that, sort of that being given. Then I got a call from the bishop, and he said that a new couple was moving into the ward. And I had grown kind of bitter because I had met first with the people who had been on the longest, and I hadn't had necessarily the best experiences, which is heartbreaking. But he said, this new couple's moving in. They've asked for help. Will you go sit down with them? And I was almost feeling a little jaded. I walked in like, what now? And, introduced myself and sat down with them. And they had just finished school in Ohio, somewhere like that, and had moved. It had taken all of their savings to move them and their young children. And he said, yeah, we could use a food order and we could use help with, rent for a month or two. And he kind of had it laid out. And the spirit was so overwhelming in that room that I kept having to not cry, because the spirit was just telling me, this is who it's for and this is how it works. And these people need this. And I went back to the bishop and said, they are amazing, whatever they need, I can just tell. And then the most special thing that happened, probably 2 or 3 months later, they called and asked if I'd come over to their house. And I went over and they said, hey, we just want to let you know, we've let the bishop know. We no longer need any assistance. My job is kicked in. We're good. We're all fine now. Now, how can we pay this back? And I said, that's not the way it works. You don't pay it back. They said, no. We know we're not going to write a check, but we need a list of service opportunities. Gosh, this happened so long ago, 25 years ago. I still get so emotional. They said, we need to pay this back to the Lord. Can we go to the bishop's storehouse? Can we serve? Is there a couple that needs babysitting from us? What can we do to pay this back? And that lesson I learned was so wonderful. And a lot of those other people who had just, I can't say to no fault of their own, but they started out altruistically and unfortunately got a little turned. But we were able to fix things with them also. And I found this beautiful experience and just fell in love with all of this, with the way the church does its donations and the way it helps people. It's a beautiful program. And I love that we talk about it the way that Sister Roberto does, that it's beautiful, it's wonderful, and we shouldn't feel bad for when we need times. There is a season when we are giving, and there is a season when we are all in need. It goes back to my favorite scripture in the world. Are we not all beggars? Do we not all rely on that same God? We do, and we are.
It reminds me of really the atonement of the Savior. The Savior is not so much about the amount of grace that he has to extend to us, because, what's the difference between 1,000 talents and 1,005? But our attitude towards the grace that he extends towards us.
Yeah, absolutely love it. And then we're not going to end this without talking about the little boy who thought that every time he paid his dollar, thought it was building an entire church. I mean, come on. Is that just the coolest? And the fact that she thought to include that, I thought it was just awesome.
I think that's her son. I'm just put this out. Whenever general authorities and general officers, I say, well, a boy said to his mother, it's like, okay, yeah, this is something that happened in your home a few years ago, isn't it?
But Mom, don't say my name.
Yeah, exactly. Mom, you embarrassed me in general conference again.
Come on, Mom, knock it off. My friends are watching. Exactly. Yeah, I love her reply. I love the reply. That is lovely. It's a lovely thought. The kid's saying, isn't it silly? And he says, yes, they were beautiful, and there were millions of them. Let us have the faith of a child. There's just so much in this talk. There's so much, the balm of Gilead, the healing that is in this talk. And, what does it come back to? You're good enough. Come as a child. We are the church. I mean, the messages for people, and we need this messaging to go out, that whatever hangups people have. Many years ago, I was in Southern California with one of my customers, and there was a girl who was working for this company. She was a sales rep, and I knew her well, but I didn't know she was actually a member of the church. And somebody in their company mentioned, oh, yeah, you know that she's a member of your faith. And I said, I didn't know that. And she goes, oh, whoops, I wasn't supposed to tell you because she's not active and she smokes. She's a pretty heavy smoker. And I walked out and she was standing outside. And I said, hey, I just found out you're a member of our church. And she went, oh, no. And she quickly put out her cigarette. And I said, well, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your smoke break. And she said, I didn't want you to know because I know you're very active. And she said, I'm on nicotine patches. I'm trying to quit. And I said, great. What's your ward like? Who's your bishop? Tell me about your ward. And she said, well, I'm not going. She said, but my goal is to quit within X number of months. And once I quit, then I'm going to start going to church.
She needs to watch that general conference talk about the bishop who extended a smoking member a calling to be a youth Sunday school teacher.
Yes. Well, I told her, I said, I think your plan is perfect. I have a similar plan. My goal is to lose 50 pounds, and then I'm going to start going to the gym. And she looked at me and she laughed, and I said, my statement is absolutely as ridiculous as yours. Go to church to better your life, to better yourself. And if you smoke the rest of your life and go to church, you are much better than smoking the rest of your life and not going to church. The atonement is for you. And she and I had this amazing conversation. And I think that we put up borders. And unfortunately, I think sometimes we put up those borders in our own mind, like I'm not good enough, whatever. But I also think sometimes there really are members of the church who smell cigarette smoke or who see a tattoo or see a weird hair color or whatever and have that thought of, and we have to be careful. She says toward the end, as the peaceable followers of Christ, we are striving to become of one heart and one mind. I just love that. We are striving to become like Jesus Christ. We have to be careful we are the church. That's a responsibility. I have a son who is 18 now, who is just awesome. And he's a tall, good looking kid. And for a while he grew out his hair. He, grew it out close to his shoulders, and he would stand up there and he would bless the sacrament, and fully worthy to do so, looking sharp.
Actually looking a little like Jesus too.
Did look a little bit like Jesus, yes, with his slightly longer hair. And I remember many years ago those battles, and sometimes I remember a bishop who drew a hard line. And, fortunately, our bishop is just awesome with our young men and worries more about their worthiness. But there was an older sister in the ward, quite a bit older, and she called my wife one Sunday and said, I just want you to know how much I love your son. And he does such a good job up there. And I just wanted to offer to you that I'd be happy to drive him to get a haircut. If I'd be happy to, I'm retired and I know you work. And so I'd be more than happy. I know a really wonderful hairdresser who would give him such a nice missionary haircut. And, fortunately, my wife's a return missionary. We're still in the temple. We're active our whole lives. And this woman was older, and my wife was able to say, what a wonderful thing to offer. Thank you so much. But can you imagine if my wife was on the edge? Can you imagine if my son was on the edge? We have to be careful, Matthew. We have to be careful. We don't know what people's situations are. And it was obvious to me that while she was saying, I love your son, I love the spirit he brings and everything else.
But.
Yes, but welcome to church, but. And this is why I love Sister Roberto, is if we're doing welcome to the church, but we have a problem. And the Lord has said, as she ends with this, behold, I will hasten my work in its time. It's time. It's time. We cannot in this day and age afford. I work with YSAs in my high council calling. I will just tell you, we cannot right now be a welcome to church, but you are welcome here, but you are a member of the church, but we cannot have that. The work is hastening and we are the church. And that's a huge responsibility. And we have to be the church. We have to build that scaffolding. We have to welcome all. And I think Sister Roberto just nailed it. I love this talk.
Elder Uchtdorf said, "There's no sign on our church building saying you must be this worthy to enter."
Yes.
And sometimes we put off that vibe. We certainly do. And that Satan is so good, even if we're doing our best not to put that vibe off, he tells us when we make mistakes, look at them. Mm-hmm. They're so good. You never fit in. You don't belong here. You're not good enough to be here. You're not doing enough. One of the parts that I almost laughed at, almost cried at in her talk was when she said that there are women who've come up to her thinking that they're apologizing, that they're not active members of Relief Society because they're serving in primary young women. I'm the elders quorum president. I'm thinking, I've never had an elder come up to me and say, wow, gee, Brother Watkins, yeah, I'm sorry I'm not an active member of elders quorum because I'm in primary or young men's. No, never hear anything like that. And I thought it was a little ridiculous. And I asked my wife just actually a few minutes before we recorded. I knew that she hadn't quite remembered this exact moment of the talk. So I said, hey, sweetheart, do you consider yourself an active member of Relief Society? Now, she's been in primary for like 10 years.
Yeah.
And she said, well, no, because I'm in primary. And I was like, you said it too. But really, it's so easy to think I'm not doing enough because I'm not in this specific place, in this specific circumstance, doing this specific type of thing. And she says, Sister Roberto says, she talks about, the kid with the money and the tithing and stuff. She says, have the faith, rejoice, knowing that even our smallest efforts are making a significant difference in God's kingdom. When I read that, I thought of President Nelson's talk from, I guess, a few years ago, Let God Prevail. Mm-hmm. He said, anytime we do anything that helps anyone on either side of the veil to make and keep their covenants with God, we are helping to gather Israel, which is the most important work going on in the world today. And sometimes it's just so easy to minimize the efforts we're already doing and feel discouraged because we're not sister so-and-so or brother so-and-so or elder so-and-so.
Yeah. And I can relate to that. I've felt guilt about, hey, I can't go help somebody move on a certain day. And I feel disconnected, again, and that's part of my role in High Council. I go to the YSA stake and the YSA ward quite a bit. I'm not at our ward much. And in fact, and this is kind of a sweet, maybe my last thought, which is actually kind of sweet. I don't know if you were aware, we had a pandemic recently. I
must have missed that. I'm sorry.
I don't know if you watched the news or not, but apparently there was a pandemic, and so we had a couple of years. Yeah. I don't know. Could have been global, but anyway, we had this. We had the pandemic, and then I was called to High Council, and I'm not at our ward that often. Or at least I'm not there, for both hours, and I have other meetings and responsibilities. And so I had gone to church one Sunday. This was a few months back. We're back to meeting in person and everything. My wife wasn't feeling well, so she was home, and I don't know where my son was, but I was sitting by myself basically. And your listeners can't see me. I have a beard, and I'm sitting in the back by myself, and this brother I didn't know came up to me and introduced himself. And I said, "Oh, it's wonderful to meet you." And he said, "I don't think I've seen your face before." And I said, "Oh, probably not, and tell me where you moved in." He said, "Did you just move into the ward?" And I said, "No, we've lived here for more than 20 years now." He said, "Really?" And you could see him starting to put some pieces together. And he said, "But I haven't seen you here." I said, "No, I'm not here very often, I'm afraid. Not as much as I'd like to be." And I wasn't catching what he was putting down, But, and then he shook my hand and he looked me in the eye very sweetly. He said, "Well, we're really glad you're here today. And I hope you'll want to come back." And I finally realized that he thought I was totally inactive, and he was so sweet about it and so kind, and he did have the right attitude, but I had to break his heart. And I said, "Yeah, I hope so too." Unfortunately, as part of High Council, I'm not here that often, and you could just see his entire demeanor shifted. And he went, "Wait, you're on High Council?" "Yeah, I'm on High Council. I'm very active, I promise." And he said, "Well, either way, it's wonderful to meet you." And, he had a wonderful attitude, and I was so grateful that he did come and welcome me. But, we are the church, And it's time for us to stop judging and to stop judging ourselves and our worthiness to be at church. Let's open the doors and let's all go and perfect ourselves in Christ. And God bless Sister Roberto for this talk.
And with that, it's time to say thank you, dear listener, for listening to another episode of the Conference Talk podcast, where we discussed Sister Aburto's talk, We Are the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a 5-star rating. You can find us on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google, really wherever you get podcasts. You can find links to all our platforms on our website, conferencetalk.org, which also has our social media links. You can drop us a comment, check out the show notes, and find out more about us, your hosts. Big thanks to the special guest, Shawn Rapier, for joining and hopping on mics with me today. Unfortunately, since the time that we've recorded this podcast, he gave us some very sad news that he is no longer continuing to host the Latter-day Saint Lives podcast for now, which was really sad for me as a listener because it is one of the best podcasts out there on the internet. So even though he's not putting out a whole bunch of new episodes right now, please go and give it a listen. It is inspiring and it is certainly wonderful to go through. Join us next week for another episode. And remember, we love speaking about the church and our leaders, but we don't speak for them. Everything said on this podcast by us or our hosts represent our own personal opinions. See you next week.